What's up, and welcome back to another episode of Keeping Up with the Commanders. I'm your host, Mason Kenahan, and today I am joined by Commanders beat writer for the Washington Post, Sam Fortier. Sam, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, man. It's late May and we're talking about football, and I'm excited.
Yeah, in this episode, we're going to be giving our year one expectations for the Commanders 2025 NFL draft class. But before we jump into that, I do have one question for you. It's something that has been probably the most talked about thing recently on Commanders Twitter. And I don't want to spend too much time on it because I think I know your answer already, but I'm going to ask anyways. Marshawn Lattimore and Laramie Tunsil absent from the start of Commanders OTAs. Big deal or not a big deal?
Oh wow. I thought you were gonna ask me if Jayden Daniels gained weight. I
Oh,
was like
gain weight. That too.
I was
Yeah.
like for sure that's where
That
you
too
were
is up
going.
there.
And to be clear on that, like it's funny, man. Like the Commanders did post that picture that made Jayden look
Mhm.
jacked. But yesterday I went in there and I was talking to a couple people. I don't think he looks that different, like if at all. Like maybe his arms are a little more, muscular. And Cliff
Mhm.
obviously said he's stronger, and Biotish said he's way stronger. And they see him, closer, and maybe they would see like his weight or like him step on the scale or whatever, which we don't. But he just doesn't look that different to me. And so
Mhm.
I just want to put out my opinion that I think that might be a
Yeah.
little overblown. To your point about Marshawn Lattimore and Laramie Tunsil, and also Terry McLaurin was not there.
Yeah, I think we know why though, with like the contract. That kind of makes sense. So that's why I left him out. But back to you.
Right. I would say Tunsil is not a guy who participated in these voluntary programs in Houston and has remained one of the best left tackles in the league. I'm not concerned about him. He's just,
Mhm.
I know the offensive line is one and they work together, but like if you tell Tunsil to go out an island and do some pass pro reps, I think he's going to be just fine.
Yeah.
Um, Marshawn Lattimore obviously is the big one because of how he struggled, and the fan base is I think justifiably frustrated. And
Mhm.
Peters bet pretty big on him at the deadline. To me, this is not a big deal if he plays well. It's sort of like Chase Young. Like Chase Young, his
Yeah.
sophomore year, skipped the voluntary program at OTAs. He was in LA filming commercials, and like even back then, I remember talking with John Keim, and it's like, man, this is not a big deal if dude comes in, balls out, has like
Yeah.
12 sacks. Like, no one will care that he missed practices in May. But like the same thing, like when he shows up and then has one sack in 8 weeks or whatever it was, like then people are upset. They're like, hey, like you should have
Mhm.
had these reps. You should have been working together with your teammates. And I think it's the same thing with Lattimore. Like if he comes out and has 2 picks in week one, like no one is going to remember this conversation we're having right
Yeah.
now. But if he comes out and gets toasted, as he did at moments like late last year, then people are going to have a problem with it. And so
Mhm.
that's a bet that Marshawn Lattimore is making. And I guarantee Joe Witt is still with a player of his caliber going to say, okay, like Marshawn's a big part of our plans. We want him to be him. Um, but these are the little things that, like in retrospect, can add up if you don't play well.
Yeah, and I mean, we know it's the offseason when we're talking about Jayden Daniels' arms, how big they are, and people missing voluntary practices. But yeah, let's move on from that though. Last season, there were a lot of expectations, I would say, placed on the Commanders' 2024 draft class, and especially at the top, early returns show that Washington kind of hit a home run, especially with their first round pick. Now, Peters looks to continue to build on his drafting success as he brought in 5 new guys as a part of the 2025 NFL draft class. So I kind of wanted in this episode to talk about our year one expectations for some of these guys because there was a lot of things, a lot of ways Adam Peters could have gone within these picks. I know since they didn't really have that many picks at the top, really only 2 in the first 3 rounds, that there was a lot of talks about trading back and acquiring more quantity, you could say, over quality. But it really looked like Peters went for quality over quantity with what he had going into this class. So let's start with Josh Connolly Jr. As everyone knows, the first round pick for Washington. Not many, I would say, fans expected Washington to go and address the offensive line in the first round, especially after trading for Laramie Tunsil. But I also don't see many fans mad about this pick either. What are the chances, in your opinion, Connolly starts week one? And what have you, I know you've been at OTAs, what have you liked to see out of him so far, even though, again, it's not padded or anything?
Yeah, I think that we should also zoom out here because I think that when people are going to talk about this draft class, we're going to talk about the 5 players they picked. Obviously, those are the guys they drafted. But when Adam Peters has talked about successful draft, normally you have your allotment of 7 picks and you want 3 starters out of those picks.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, like when I think about this draft, I do include Marshawn Lattimore and Laramie Tunsil Debo, not Lattimore as much, like Debo in that mix because those are picks that they were going to have this year. So like I know that you don't have the years of control and you don't have the youth if you trade a 5th round pick for Debo as you might with the guy that you would have taken. But to me, like if Debo hits, if Debo is who you want him to be, and then you re-sign him to a deal, like that, relatively is a better return than probably what you would get for an average 5th round pick. So I think it's important we talk about the 5 players because they're the cornerstones. They're here for 4 years, not at a minimum, but they have 4-year contracts, and that's going to be really important to the bedrock of this team. But I don't think the draft class is really limited to just the 5 guys for what that's worth.
Go ahead. I don't know. You go ahead.
So that's just one note that I would put in that. Josh Connerly. I mean, yeah, look, he's a massive guy who is very athletic, and I think he's fitting in well. It's really hard to get a read, like you said, on offensive linemen when they're in pads, but I do think it's important. Yesterday being the first open period with rookies and vets, like him working alongside whoever that right guard is going to be while Sam Cosmi recovers is going to be important. And it's the sort of thing, if he ends up being the starting right tackle, he's going to compete at that spot with Brandon Coleman. I think that the loser of that job will probably end up being the swing tackle and great depth. But that's where I would imagine he'll be and where he's taken snaps. So, but he's also taken snaps at other spots, because it was hard to get a read on where exactly everybody was going to be because Laramie Tunsil wasn't there, which changes the whole dynamic, and everybody takes snaps at different positions. So it's hard to read too much into that. But really, like in week 1, I imagine it'll be Connerly or Brandon Coleman lining up at right tackle across from Tunsil. Connerly, when you watch him on film, especially against Abdul Carter, when they played Penn State, like he's a really impressive guy. Can he stick at tackle? He played almost exclusively tackle in college. Where will he line up? What will he end up being? That's an open question. But I think that, promising early returns so far.
Yeah, I think it's also really interesting that he is going to, if he were to start on the line, it's probably going to be on that right side. And so I wanted to look at like some of the success that college left tackles that moved over to the right side had as a rookie in recent years. And you look at some of the guys who made that move. Joe Alt last year had a very impressive rookie season. You also had guys though that Paris Johnson and Anton Harrison, 2 guys that definitely saw some ups and downs from both of them moving over to that right side from playing the left side in college. So it's going to be really interesting, in my opinion, to see how fast is Conley going to be able to adjust to the right side. Because for some guys, it's like almost seamless, while for others, it takes some time. But overall, I think we're both pretty excited about the pick.
Yeah, and I think that when you talk about the performance of offensive linemen, particularly rookie tackles, I think a lot of that has to do with scheme and the quarterback too. I think the guys that you mentioned are a great example. Connerly, if he does start at right tackle, will have a huge benefit in having Jayden Daniels, who obviously made the offensive line look great last year because he could get the ball out of his hands, he could escape pressure. I had one offensive lineman tell me in the locker room once, like, PFF says I have no sacks, but I probably should have had 2 if Jayden hadn't been able to run away from him. So like, guys know the power that like having Cliff and Jayden and now with Debo having an underneath threat who can break off some yak. Like, I think this offense is going to fit and help offensive linemen across the board, and hopefully for a rookie, that's some good comfort as well.
Yeah, and so that's Josh Connerly in the first round. Washington then went on, and even though some people may expected them to trade down from either 20, 29, or 61, they went on to make a selection at 61. And it was someone that, after watching the Commanders log that just released the other night, Trey Amos was who they selected at number 61, and Adam Peters seemed very, very excited about Amos. He said in the recent Commanders log that he felt like he was getting two first-round players in one draft class, and even though he only selected one player technically in the first round, this was my favorite pick in the draft. I think Amos is a star. I had a first-round grade on him. Are you excited? Are you as excited about this pick as I am?
Yeah, I think Amos is a talented player who fits a position of need and could be a really valuable contributor. I will say that I do have some concerns about him. ESPN reported that his back injury, which I was not aware of in the pre-draft process, caused him to slip. So, and obviously the Commanders, if this affects him, it would be the second time in as many drafts for Adam Peters where they take, a guy with injury concerns who fell into the second round along with defensive tackle Johnny Newton. So Trey Amos, I mean, obviously he looked great yesterday. He had a couple interceptions of Jayden Daniels, which I wouldn't make too much about because it's like they're still figuring out timing. Receivers slip on one of them. There was a tipped pass. So it wasn't a huge deal. But at the same time, you always want to see DBs getting their hands on the ball, and Amos was able to do that yesterday just in the limited reps that we saw. So he has stood out early, but I think especially with corners, while I like Amos, while the tape is good, while watching him run around in person, he looks good. I'm always wary of buying too much stock just because I remember, I showed up to watch Emmanuel Forbes a couple of years ago, and he looked great, and he would get up to the line, he would challenge Terry, and he got his hands on balls, and I was like, dang, they got a real player in Forbes. And I spent a lot of these months, the May, June, July, August, talking about, okay, how are he and Benjamin St. Juste going to pair? And then we get to the season, and what you see doesn't always translate. So Trey Amos, I like him. I think there's a lot of potential there, but it's not real until it's on the field.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also, I do find it interesting as Amos wasn't the only player in that secondary Washington added over the offseason, how Amos is going to come in and kind of be in this rotation, because you've got Lattimore on the outside. Is Sanders still going to move back inside, or is he going to stay on the outside? And where Amos kind of fits in that scenario? If Sanders still does play inside, is Amos going to be starting on the outside then? Where do you see Amos kind of fitting in week one, in the rotation week one, just with all these pieces and the flexibility that guys like Sanders still and also Igbenogany has as well?
Great question. I asked Adam Peters that the night they drafted him. I was like, where do you see this guy fitting in? Could he play in the slot? Didn't play in the slot a ton in college. And AP told me, look, man, his bread and butter is an outside corner, press man, get to the line, be physical with his hands. Obviously, they're never going to rule anything out. They always want guys with position flex. But to me, the likeliest outcome is either Sandra still in the slot and Amos and Lattimore on the outside, or maybe Sandra still and Lattimore outside with Jonathan Jones in the slot. Noah, as you mentioned, could be in the slot. It's not they're going to battle that out in training camp for sure, but those two scenarios seem like the likeliest to me.
Okay, that makes sense. With Amos probably playing, I would say, the outside week one, whether that's not being one of the first two or coming as a third guy in the rotation or actually just starting out there. But let's move on from Trey Amos on to now one of the more, you could say, flashy players in this class, especially on the offensive side of the ball for Washington. That's Virginia Tech wide receiver Jaylen Lane. Washington has lacked an explosive punt returner, I felt, for a while now. But Lane has that ability as a punt returner to create some explosive plays. He's returned punts all the way to the house multiple times in his college career. He averaged 9.8 yards per return as a punt returner last year. Where do you kind of see Lane most likely being probably that punt returner for Washington this season? Do you expect that to be the case for Jaylen Lane this year?
I do. I think that's his surest way onto the field. I asked Cliff Kingsbury yesterday, what do you expect from the rookies on to have offensive roles? And he said, it's a loaded room. I mean, those guys are going to have to get in where they fit in. There's not a lot of footballs to go around. It's just one. So, I mean, Jaylen Lane and Jakori Merritt, the running back, I would expect both of them to have pretty limited. I know that we're getting ahead of your PowerPoint. I'm sorry about that. But I would expect both those guys to really need to like earn their touches. And so I wouldn't expect Cliff to be like drawing anything up for Jaylen Lane, and his probably his surest way to contribute is as a punt returner. And I would say, man, like I've covered this team for 5 seasons. The first time I ever went to FedEx, or then it was FedEx, was for a Lions Skins game in 19. And like they sent me out there because the tickets were like $6, and so I just like had to go write a scene. I had just finished covering the Nationals World Series, and they were like, "Go write a scene story." And I think in that game, or maybe it was a later game, but Steven Sims had a return touchdown. I can't remember if it was a punt or a kick, but I just remember thinking like, "Oh, like that was an exciting return." And then over the next 5 years, as I covered the team day in and day out, I was like, dang, there's not a lot of exciting returns here. I watched Dax Milne wave for a fair catch a fair number of times. You know what I mean? So, so if they have an exciting returner, I think that would be not only helpful to the team, but it would be exciting to watch for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jaylen Lane hopes to be that exciting returner for Washington for the years to come. But I also want to talk about Lane as a wide receiver, because I think we can both agree punt returner will probably be the way Lane makes it onto this team. But with kind of a loaded wide receiver room, especially on the back end with a lot of veterans, guys like Michael Gallup and KJ Osborne, it'll be interesting to see if Washington ends up keeping 6 or 7 wide receivers on this roster. What are your what are your expectations for Lane as a wide receiver, from a wide receiver point of view?
Probably a developmental guy. I mean, he does offer explosiveness and speed that they've lacked at that position. Can play inside or outside. I would expect him to probably be a little bit more on the inside. Maybe there's a if he proves that he can handle it, maybe like some jet sweep actions. It wasn't a guy that like got a lot of downfield targets in college. So maybe some more underneath stuff, if Debo's banged up or, needs to catch his breath or whatever, maybe he becomes that guy to step in. But as you mentioned, it's going to be competitive for that role. I would definitely expect him to have a leg up on Gallup and Osborne, just because, with the Rick deal, they want to develop him. They want him to be in their long-term plans. So he's a guy that I think has developmental upside, but I wouldn't expect to have a huge role as a receiver this year.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, especially with guys like potentially Luke McCaffrey having a bigger role this year. I do expect Lane to kind of be on the back end of, the wide receiver room in terms of just wide receivers overall. But again, he can still make a major impact on special teams, and we've seen players over the years have that's where they start to have their role first, and then it becomes more of an offense, more involved in the offense as well. But let's move on to now Kane Madrono, who was one of the more interesting picks out of all of the picks. Madrono, at least for me, was the one I was least familiar with coming in, but it also is someone that I think makes a lot of sense for this Washington team. He's got that connection with Ken Norton, of course, at UCLA, and with the status of kind of Bobby Wagner really up in the air after this year, you've got a couple of developmental guys behind him, which is pretty important. What were your thoughts on the Madrono pick, and do you see him more as a developmental linebacker to kind of potentially be the Bobby Wagner replacement once Wagner ends up leaving?
I think Bobby Wagner replacement is really ambitious. Really, really. I mean, there's not every day 3 linebacker is going to be Fred Warner. And so I think that like Kane Madrono, to me, especially this year, like to me, he fits into the Dom Hampton draft pick from last year, the guy from Washington, safety linebacker hybrid. Like he kind of has that body, maybe not the testing numbers aren't as good, but he's instinctive. He seems to play pretty well. To me, he's a special teams guy that maybe can work his way into a linebacker role, more off ball. But maybe in some certain sub packages, I would not expect him to be a guy that shows up this year. But obviously, having Ken Norton's endorsement means a lot. Ken Norton knows linebackers better than I do, so maybe he does become something more than I expect. But as of right now, I think my expectations for him, both short term and long term, are relatively modest.
Okay, yeah, and saying Bobby Wagner replacement there was definitely a little bit ambitious for me, but I do get your point here on like seems more of a developmental kind of special teamer for Washington. I do like, I guess this kind of goes kind of already answered, but Does Madrono affect? I was wondering if he affects a guy like Jordan McGee's playing time, because I know McGee's season last year was kind of like hit with multiple injuries throughout the course of the season. Should we expect like a bigger role from McGee this year? And is he someone we should be looking at as taking more? I'm not gonna say replacement, but more of the snaps if Bobby Wagner were to leave after this year. Some of those snaps next in 2026.
I think Jordan McGee is definitely in line to be like that kind of next guy up, especially when you consider that the Commanders really didn't play that many 3 linebacker sets last year, almost exclusively in nickel and dime. And if Bobby were to go down, obviously Frankie would assume a bigger role, but I think McGee would be that next guy up, and Madrono probably behind him, and then obviously other guys in the mix. But that position is not, obviously they have two good players at linebacker, but it's not the focal point of the defense in the way that maybe it is for some other teams. But that being said, I mean, I think you have to love where that unit's at, especially with the way that Bobby and Frankie complement each other and complement that front, and people love playing with those guys. So I think that the linebacker unit in general is in a pretty good spot headed into the season.
Yeah, I think it was huge just to get Bobby Wagner back for at least one more year just going into this season, because it gives some more time for some of these younger guys like McGee and now Madrono as well to kind of learn from some of these veterans like Wagner and Luvu. But yeah, I think it's definitely big that Wagner is coming back for this year. Now let's go on to the final pick that Adam Peters and the Commanders made, and that was Jakori Merritt, the running back out of Arizona. There's been some questions, and I know a lot of fans on Twitter really wanted Washington to draft a running back at some point in this draft, and they did it with their last pick. I think this is a very fun pick for Washington. Merritt was the Shrine Bowl offensive MVP this year. It's been a very unique college career for Merritt, especially over the last couple of years. But what are your thoughts on the pick, and could Merritt have end up having a pretty significant role in the backfield by the end of this season?
Significant feels a little ambitious for the reasons that we talked about earlier. I just think that it's going to be really hard for him to get touches, especially behind Brian Robinson and Eckler and Deebo Samuel in the run game. And, obviously they really like what Jeremy McNichols can do. And he's proven to be really good in pass protection as well, which, we don't know as much about Jakori Merritt. And Merritt was not a huge factor in the pass game in college, especially the year, not his junior year, but his senior year, his first senior year. It was not a huge factor in the pass game, had 7 catches. So it's not like we should expect him to be a do-it-all Eckler type, more of a one-cut, kind of – he is fluid, and he's, really fun to watch. But I don't necessarily think that, he's going to come in and – it's totally possible that he does. It's totally possible he comes in and seizes that moment, and in which case I would say great for him. But he's really going to have to show up and impress, I think, right away to do that.
Yeah, and I do think with Brian Robinson, Austin Eckler, both of them have had kind of they neither of them have been able to play kind of like a full 17 games, and there have been games where they've only gone in with one of those two guys just last season as well. And does this mean that would that give Merritt some more playing time, I guess, or would they more so go to a guy that they know of like Jeremy McNichols first, or is that kind of like a training camp battle for those snaps past Robinson and Eckler, you would say?
Yeah, I think it's totally up for grabs. Chris Rodriguez is another name that factors in. I know fans really like him. The team clearly prefers Brian Robinson, as we saw at the end of the year. But, yeah. I mean, he's another name that has always stepped up during his chances. And so he's a guy who's going to be battling for that spot. But, yeah, I mean, Cliff had a comment yesterday about, he knows he's going to get cussed out this year because they have more talented players in the offense. And so I went through and wrote an article where I was just basically, okay, let's look at those touches. If you look at the historical data, they're probably going to have about 1,100 snaps this year on offense. probably they're going to pass more than they run. But if you look at we're just going to talk about the rushes here. They're probably going to have about 480 rushes, like design rushes this year that Cliff calls, excluding the Jayden scrambles. The bulk of those are going to be handled by Eckler, Robinson, and Samuel. And that's going to leave, if that all tracks, and obviously it's going to depend on opponent and health and things like that. But just if you think about the whole season, if there are 100-ish touches up for grabs between McNichols, Rodriguez, Krosky Merritt, other people, like I do think Krosky Merritt can get, like he can get some of those for sure. I mean, they drafted him because they liked him. He's 7th-round pick, so he's not guaranteed a spot on the roster or a role or anything like that. But if you're him and you're looking at those two other guys and the other guys that the younger guys that you have battling, like I think that you have to feel okay about your chances, and that you can show up and outwork everybody and get it done. But at the same time, I mean, Rodriguez and McNichols, like they don't have youth, but they have experience. That's the natural trade-off. And like, as long as Jeremy McNichols is in Washington, I will just see him picking up that blitz when Jayden throws the touchdown in Cincinnati, like to seal that win. And like, that goes a long way. Like if you're a coach and you know that when you send this guy out on the field in the most critical moment and he can just like come through for you, especially when like the starter goes down, that's going to be really hard to give up. And so Krosky Merritt's really going to have to prove like, hey, you should trust me.
Yeah. And yeah, that's a great point with, I guess McNichols. I mean, it wasn't even just that touchdown against the Bengals. There was multiple times where I felt he made a big play in pass pro. In how many close games was Washington last year, especially down that stretch. I feel like there was multiple times that he made some pretty big blocks on some late 3rd, 4th downs throughout the season. But yeah, so that is the draft class. Now let's go to some UDFAs that Washington signed. I know some of them are at OTAs and all of that, and some of them were just mini camp invites. But are there any UDFAs that you think have stood out to you so far? And any UDFAs that I know last year we saw a guy like Tyler Owens kind of break out and find himself onto that roster, the final roster. Is there anyone like that you could find potentially stealing a spot onto the roster?
I know that we just talked about how like loaded the offensive skill players are, but like yesterday at practice, Jakori Brooks, the Louisville receiver, like made a catch, and I like looked over at Logan Paulson, and I was like, okay, like he's certainly impressed, and I think some of the other guys, I didn't really see too many like plays that I think stood out. And again, like you always discount it a little bit just because, it's routes on air and everything. But I thought Jakori Brooks, like that was the guy who like, I was like, okay, like maybe we're talking about something here, but it's going to be competitive. I know that Ricky Barber, the defensive tackle from UCF is another name people are talking about, but I would say those two guys, mostly Brooks are the ones that stood out to me yesterday. But that's something that, there's one more open practice, in OTAs next week, and then we have the 3-day mini camp. So that's definitely something I'm going to be keyed in on.
Yeah, and I've been loving your coverage so far for OTAs, and now going into June and mini camp and all of that is going to be a lot of fun. So, where can people find your work at the Washington Post?
Yeah, you can read it in the Washington Post, WashingtonPost.com. You can find me on X or Instagram or TikTok, SAM4TR, and then there's maybe there's a WP in there, but SAM4TR. As long as you remember that, you'll be okay.
Awesome, and thank you for your time. This was one I've been wanting to do for a while, so learned a lot of stuff about these rookies, and I'm excited for this class for Adam Peters, his second draft class as a GM. But that'll do it for this week's episode of Keeping Up with the Commanders. We'll be back next week with more. See you guys in the next one. Peace.